studying this morning, we'll be dealing with the Abrahamic covenant in one specific area, and that's the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant. Let's turn our Bibles to the book of Bereshit, or the book of Genesis, chapter 12. That will provide the introduction, and then we'll be doing a survey of much of what is being taught. Chapter 12 will focus on verse 3. We'll open up at verse 1. And Jehovah said unto Abram, Get you out of your country, and from your kindred, and from your father's house, unto land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. Now we're going to hit the key verse, verse 3. I will bless them that bless you, but him that curses you will I curse, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, God makes a covenantal relationship with Abraham. It is a covenant, but it's also an unconditional covenant. And therefore, it's not based on how good Abraham is, how good Isaac is, or good Jacob is, or the other way around. God's going to continue using this covenantal blessing in fulfillment as you move from different parts of the scriptures and also different parts of our history. Let's begin then with the outworking on an individual basis. Staying with Genesis chapter 12, we come to Abraham in chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. Chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. And when Abraham finally came into the promised land, shortly thereafter a famine began to hit the country. So he felt he had to go down to Egypt to be sustained, because the famine did not affect Egypt as it affected the land of that day, not yet Israel, but the land of that day, the land of Canaan. As he began to go down to Egypt, figuring that Egypt is not suffering the problem, what happens in verses 10 through 20, that Abraham began to realize on the journey to Egypt that there was maybe certain problems with Egyptian society. The Egyptian society was very much against violating the principle of marriage covenant, and therefore they would be really shy about murdering the husband for the sake of getting a wife. They would not try to merely take the wife away, but they would have to kill the husband. And because the husband is killed, the wife is now by herself, and there's no problem with anybody taking the woman to be married to. That's kind of a blur in the moral standards of that day. But the one that's being cursed now is Pharaoh in chapter 12, verses 10 through 20, because as he comes in, Sarah happened to be a very beautiful woman in spite of her age. And so what Pharaoh did was begin to take Sarah into his harem. And all of a sudden, God began to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant in that if he was blessing Abram, he would be blessed, but in this case he was cursing Abram, and therefore be a curse that will be filled out. Let's look at verse 16. And he dealt well with Abram for her sake. And he had sheep and oxen and male donkeys and men servants and female servants and female donkeys and camels. And so the one that would normally receive the bride price would be the father, but in this case the father no longer lived. And so the one to receive the bride price was Abram, and the woman he was married to happened to be his half-sister. And indeed, by cursing Abraham in this way, suddenly God began to plague the house of Pharaoh. And look at verse 17. And Jehovah plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And so God began to initially bless Abram and those coming in contact with him, but now the judgment falls because now he was suffering the curse against Abram. And his wife was taken away from him and put into Pharaoh's harem. And the truth finally came out. And so what the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt, did is in verse 18. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you have done unto me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" And he passed her off only as his sister, and he was his half-sister. She was the half-sister to Abram. But it was not a total situation because he was also a full brother with her. But he got his wife back. But what the king of Egypt did was he expelled Abram. So verse 19, "Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now therefore, behold, the wife take her and go your way." And Pharaoh gave men charge concerning him that they brought him under way, and his wife, and all that he had. Well, Abraham received a lot of extra wealth because he was given the bride price. But at this point, when he began to realize there was a moral problem here, he was being expelled from Egypt, go back to the land of Canaan, and God will take care of him once he returns to the land of Canaan. Now let's go to chapter 20 of Genesis. Here's a second example of the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant. In chapter 20, verses 1 through 18, you have the account. We're going to focus just on the first 3 verses. "And Abraham journeyed from thence to the land of the Negev, and he dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, that she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, took her away into his harem." Here again we have a problem. She was his sister, but she was his half-sister, and she was also his wife. And therefore, trying to pass the wife as strictly his sister, the king of the land of Shur and so on, and the king of Gerar took her, and then God began judging him. So verse 3, notice, "And God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, Behold, you are but a dead man, because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Here again, God had to rectify. The wife was restored back to Abram. Otherwise, he would continue to suffer the curse of God upon the city and upon the land. So look at verse 18. Notice what the curse was. Verse 18, "For Jehovah had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife." So you have 2 situations where Sarah was passed off as a sister only, but she was only a half-sister. And furthermore, the wife was taken away. As a result, God began to move from blessing to cursing. That's just 2 incidences with the case of Abraham. Now let's go to Jacob, and let's go to Genesis chapter 30. Genesis chapter 30. In chapter 30, verses 25 through verse 30, what we see is, again, a blessing being exchanged with a curse. So in chapter 30, look at verse 25. "And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go to mine own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, for I have served you. For I have served you well, and let me go. For you know my service wherewith I have served you. And Laban said unto him, If not found favor in your eyes, stay. For I have divined that Jehovah hath blessed me for your sake." Now here again we have a situation where Jacob had to flee his home because of a situation with his half-brother. And as he went back to the family origins, and he began serving Laban, who was his uncle, and God began blessing him in many different ways. But then a change took place because he blessed Jacob to a certain point, but then the curse began to be applied. As a result, a curse began to be applied. As a result, blessings turned into cursing. The blessing facet of the Abrahamic covenant was now working out on the cursing facet of the Abrahamic covenant. As a result, Jacob chose to flee the household while his uncle was simply far away. And the land began to pursue him after he fled. And when he came close to the border with the land of Canaan, not in Canaan yet, but close to the border of Canaan, that is when God again provided a blessing. And while Laban did catch up to Jacob, God had already warned him not to do anything negative against Jacob, because God has already begun to provide special supernatural coordination and supernatural attendance for Jacob and his family. So we find in chapter 30, verses 25 to 30, initially Laban was blessed, but now he was being cursed. And the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant continues in a specific way. Let's look at one more example and go to chapter 39. So far, these have been individual blessings or individual cursings. Now we come to the issue of Joseph. And the brothers of Joseph sold him as a slave in chapter 37 and chapter 39. And so Joseph now became a slave working for a man named Potiphar in Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 through 6. Genesis 39, verses 1 through 6. And eventually what happens is that Joseph, being negated by his half-brothers and half-brothers, what he now had to do is to find a way to explain things away, because Joseph was now sold as a slave to the Egyptians and to one particular individual, a man named Potiphar. And we see in chapter 39, verses 1 through 6, when Potiphar was blessing Joseph, God was blessing him, but when Potiphar began to do negative things, like jailing him, then God began to jail as well. So there are examples here, Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, and how God's blessings worked out to certain individuals, but then also God's curses fell on those same individuals when they failed to continue fulfilling the positive elements of the Abrahamic covenant. And therefore, in the Abrahamic covenant, there was the blessing, but also the cursing. But the cursing was unique in that it was curse for curse in kind. Curse for curse in kind. What that means is this: the way the Jew was cursed, God would then apply the very same curse upon the one doing the cursing. And that's the way judgment came. Now, so far, these are examples of the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant on the individual basis, but now we're going to look at the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant on a national basis. Now let's move on to the book of Exodus, chapter 1. In the years between the close of Genesis and the opening of Exodus, things have changed rather radically, and by this time, the Jews have been turned into a people of slavery. And what happened to Egypt was two phases. First of all, simple anti-Semitism. And this part is in chapter 1, verses 8 to 14. And the intent was to work the Jews so hard so they wouldn't have relationship with their wives, and the Jewish population would begin to dwindle bit by bit by bit. But instead, God was blessing the Jewish people, and the Jewish numbers increased in spite of their hard labor they had to work with. That's in chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. And when the Egyptian leaders realized that the Jewish population was getting blessed, not cursed, there came a second phase in chapter 1, verses 15 to 22, chapter 1, verses 15 to 22. And now we have a policy of genocide. And the midwives who were responsible to watch the birth of the children of the Jewish people, if a daughter was born, they were to let the daughter live, but if a son was born, they were to kill the son by drowning them in the Nile River. So God now began to work in the cursing facet. And skip over to chapter 4, verse 22. Chapter 4, verse 22. And thus shall you say unto Pharaoh, thus says Jehovah, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And I have said unto you, let my son go, that he may serve me, and you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will slay your son and your firstborn. And so in the working of the curse, there are going to be 10 plagues that will fall upon the Egyptian population. And the very ways the Jews had been cursed previously, the curse fell upon the Egyptian population. And you had 10 plagues fall upon the land of Egypt, but the worst of the plagues was the 10th plague, because that was curse for cursing kind. And those who already killed Jewish babies, now their sons were going to be killed also by drowning. And then we have the 10th curse, which is the crossing of the Red Sea. And you'll notice in chapter 11, verse 7. Chapter 11, verse 7. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or a beast, that ye may know how that Jehovah does make a distinction between the Egyptians and Israel. And so the way the Jews were being persecuted now, the same persecutions will fall upon the Egyptian population. And the high point is the Red Sea incident. Finally, Moses led them to the banks of the Red Sea, but they couldn't cross it because the Red Sea was not simple shallow water at this stage. So what God did, when the Egyptians began to pursue the Jewish population, he put in an area of stiff darkness between the encampment of the Egyptians and the encampment of the Jewish people, so they could not quite see what the Jews were going to be doing. That's when God created the Red Sea incident. And what God did was divide the Red Sea, and then there was a whole strong wind coming through, dividing the sea, and what normally would have been a muddy ground all became very, very dry. And because it was dry, then that's when the Jewish people would cross at the dry spot to the other side of the river, and that way escape from the Egyptian army. However, when the Egyptian army began to pursue the Jews the next morning, And initially they were going on dry ground because the Jews already crossed on dry ground, but they crossed right between the two walls of water. And God will simply now curse the water, and the stiff walls of the water that the Egyptians were running through caved in. And the Egyptian army drowned in mass, but also focused on the firstborn sons of all the Egyptian families. So Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 to 13, is where we see another curse. Let's look at chapter 17. As the Jews were now walking through the Sinai desert, heading for the promised land, a nation called Amalek, in chapter 17, verses 8 through 13, chapter 17, verses 8 through 13, a nation called Amalek, which was strongly anti-Semitic, began to attack the Jewish rear end, attacking them and killing them. And so God then applied a curse upon Amalek. So look at chapter 17, verse 14, 17:14. And Jehovah said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book. More correct would be a scroll. And rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Verse 16. And he said, Jehovah hath sworn, Jehovah hath war with Amalek from generation to generation. And now a continuous war continues for almost 4 centuries. It began with the Amalekites attacking the Jewish rear people as they walked through the desert and killing them. So now God declared he will have a war against Amalek from generation to generation. And this war will continue for 4 centuries. Turn now to 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Look at verse 1. And Samuel said unto Saul, Jehovah sent me to anoint you to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken unto the voice of the words of Jehovah. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, I have mocked that which Amalek did to Israel, how he set himself against them in the way when he came up out of Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not. So because of the way the Amalekites attacked the Jews, now God indicates a war. The war will continue for 4 centuries. And between Exodus chapter 17 and 1 Samuel chapter 15, you have a 4-century period. But it's in this chapter that finally the Amalekites will be totally destroyed. Now we see in chapter 15, verses 1 through 8, you have 2 different groups. You have the Amalekites who cursed the Jews, and you have the Kenites who blessed the Jews. So the Amalekites were intermingling with the Kenites, so God told Moses to make sure you separate, or in this case King Saul, separate the Kenites from the Amalekites. And the Amalekites will get the curse, and the Kenites will get the blessing. And you see the blessing to the Kenites in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, verses 29 to 32. Numbers chapter 10, verses 29 to 32. Let's go to one of the worst people in his anti-Semitism, and that is Haman. Let's go to the book of Esther. One thing unique about the book of Esther is simply this. It's a 10-chapter book. That's a lot of space to talk about God, but God is not mentioned anywhere in this book. neither by Elohim, being generic, or calling them by name, Yahweh. And yet this is obviously a holy book of the Bible. But while we do not see God's name mentioned, yet we do see what God will do in his activity. So turning to chapter 3 of the book of Esther, verse 1, after these things the king Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set the seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed down and do reverence to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not down, nor did reverence. Let's skip down to verse 5. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not down and did him no reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. But he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for it made known to him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Because one Jew won't bend his knees to him, Mordecai gets very mad and angry. He won't be happy merely executing this one individual, but rather he wanted to kill all the Jews of the Persian Empire, which at this point of Jewish history would mean all the Jews of the world, the entire world Jewish population lived within the confines of the empire of that day. So in chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, he began to connive a way to try to get rid of all the Jews of the Persian Empire. So next to chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, there's now an issue, a decree that was issued. And in these two verses, 12 and 13, there was a decree issued by the king that a certain day of a certain month soon to come, they must begin to hang a hangman's noose. But not the only thing. Swords were to be passed out to all of the population of the Persian Empire that were anti-Semitic, and they were to use those swords to kill the Jews, and the gallows would be for Mordecai in particular. And so we come to Esther chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. Esther chapter 5, verses 13 and 14, Esther is aware of what's going on. And what the plan is now in chapter 5, verses 13 and 14, is they built some gallows to hang certain people. And there wants to be hanged in particular be Mordecai and some other leading Jewish people. And the others, swords will be passed out. They have to kill all the Jews anywhere in the Persian Empire. So now a judgment is set upon a certain day of a certain month, very soon to come. The Jews will become targeted for total annihilation. But a key element was to build a hangman's noose 50 cubits high, makes it the highest structure within the capital city of Shushan. And they would hang Mordecai on those gallows. So things have gotten very bad in the first 5 chapters of the book of Esther. But now look at chapter 6, verse 1. On that night, on what night? The same night that the decree was issued, that all the Jews were to be no longer tolerated, that the Jews were to be hung but moral for the mainline Jewish population, they were to be killed by the sword. So on that night, when things had gotten very bad for the Jewish people, and now they were sleeping the final night before they will carry out the decree of massacring the Jews one way or the other. Chapter 6, verse 1 says, "On that night could not the king sleep." And God is not mentioned, but God is obviously giving the king divine insomnia. He can't sleep. God is keeping him awake. On that night could not the king sleep. The one man who couldn't sleep is the king of Persia. Everybody else went to sleep, but not this one man. And so he felt he needed some bedtime stories read to him. I grew up in Brooklyn, and whenever I needed my mother to help me sleep, she would come in and read me some bedtime stories. And that's what's happening here. Somebody's going to read him some bedtime stories. So verse 1, "On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of the scroll of the records of the chronicles, and they were ready before the king. And they began to read the chronicles of the Persian Empire, what's been happening since he became the king. And somewhere in the scroll it was written how Mordecai had saved the life of the king because he overheard a conspiracy of assassination, and there's some people to carry out the assassination of the king, but now he heard about this conspiracy because they were now reading something. So he raises the question, has he done anything to honor Mordecai? Because Mordecai was the one that knew about this conspiracy. He's the one that warned the king about the conspiracy. So when Haman came in to talk to the king to finalize his plan about hanging the Jews, look at verse 7 of chapter 6. "And Haman said to the king, For the man whom the king delights to do honor, let royal apparel be brought, which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king uses to ride, and the head in which he wears a royal crown." So what's happening here is the king is now being told what he should do in a positive sense, because he will be honored with a feast that Esther herself is preparing. Now look at chapter 6. And verse 10, "Then the king said to Haman, Make haste and take the apparel and the horse as you have said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sits at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that you have spoken." What happened is that as Haman was beginning to prepare a hanging party, and he'd be going to a feast that Esther, who he probably did not know that she was Jewish, and so they would understand that he would be honored at this particular feast, but slowly ending up with his own death. So in chapter 7, they come and partake of the banquet, but skip down to verse 10. Chapter 7, verse 10. Because it was during this banquet that Esther revealed the conspiracy of Haman. And he also found out of the high gallows that we prepare for the hanging of Mordecai. So now everything has changed, curse for curse in kind. And look at verse 10 of chapter 7. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Now this hangman's noose was intended for Mordecai. Now Haman himself will hang from those same gallows. This won't solve the problem because a decree was issued on a certain day of a certain month. They were to kill all the Jews. So what happens in chapter 8 is that souls were sent out to other people that were pro-Jewish, not anti-Jewish. So they were now prepared in chapter 9, when the mobs began acting against the Jews. It is now the mobs themselves that are going to be massacred. So skipping down to chapter 9, verse 26, 9:26, wherefore they call these days Purim, or Purim, after the name of Pur. A new Jewish holiday is now inaugurated, not one that came with Moses. This is one that came in with the events of Esther. And so a new feast was inaugurated beyond. They already had the festivities of the law of Moses. It's an additional one. And that was the feast of Purim, or Purim. And this has continued to be observed to this very day, celebrating the result of what happened under Queen Esther. I'm going to summarize some things because we don't have a lot of time to talk. Give you another example. We have the event of Luke chapter 7. Let's look at it. Luke chapter 7. What you have in Luke chapter 7 in the New Testament, verses 2 through 10, the account of the Roman centurion. Now the Jews were now under Roman policies, and there were people now being ruled by Roman soldiers. But there was one Roman centurion that was very positive. He's the one that happened to be the one that built the synagogue in the town of Capernaum. That's where Jesus himself did their services. But this was Roman centurion that had a servant who was close to dying. This is Luke chapter 7, verses 2 through 10. Luke 7, verses 2 through 10. And because this was a Roman centurion who was positive towards the Jews, and he's the one, by the way, that financed the building of the synagogue in Capernaum. And it's the same synagogue the Messiah himself often was teaching in that place. So here God showed them a blessing, and Jesus decided to go ahead and bless the centurion. Didn't even go to the centurion's house. He blessed them by having the servant healed. And here God was blessing a Roman centurion that was part of the occupation over the land of Israel in those days. Moving beyond biblical history, Spain. Spain did well for the Jews for many years, but in the year 1492, the Jews were being expelled from Spain. In the end, God provided the curse upon Spain in the year 1588. 1588, the whole Spanish Armada was destroyed by a storm. If we look at Germany, there was a severe curse upon the Jews. There was a policy to annihilate the Jewish population. And the curse upon the Jews now was going to be inflicted upon Germany. And so the curse on Germany was to suffer total destruction. And destruction of Germany, you have the birth of the Jewish state. Israel was born in the wake of those instances. If we move to England, there was one man who was the prime minister's name he was a Jewish man, probably a believer. His name was Benjamin Disraeli. And because he became the prime minister, using Benjamin Disraeli is the one in charge of the Great Britain. Great Britain was suffering a lot of, not suffering, but enjoying a lot of blessings. And so it was during that period of time that Jerusalem was taken by the British under Benjamin Disraeli. And then came the Balfour Declaration, where the Balfour Declaration decreed that they were in favor of establishing a Jewish land, in the land of what was then called Palestine. And so there's a lot of blessing during the period of Benjamin Disraeli, but when you get beyond that point, you see the cursing coming because the British now were exercising backtracking on their promise. And that began to lead to the fall of the British Empire. In Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, you come to the land of Russia. In chapter 38, verse 1 through chapter 39, verse 16, you have the cursing of the Jews. And so as a result, in chapter 38, you have the curse upon Russia. This curse is not yet applied, but that's going to be applied eventually. And the greatest issue is the campaign of Armageddon. And two key passages in Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, is when the curse began to be applied. Now, moving backward again, for prophecy we haven't seen fulfilled yet, Jeremiah 31, verses 35 to 37, Jeremiah 31, verses 35 to 37. What we read about is the means of Jewish destruction, a policy to annihilate the whole Jewish population, especially in the period of the tribulation, and the whole Jewish population will disappear. But again, God would not allow that to run its course. Let me quote you a statement by Mark Twain. Here's what he wrote. Concerning the Jew, he could be vain of himself and not be ashamed of it. Yes, he could be excused for it. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persians arose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Romans followed, and a vast noise, and they are gone. Other people have come, have sprung up, have held the torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in the twilight of having vanished. The Jews sowed them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert, aggressive mind. All things are mortal, but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. And he ends up with a little question mark. This is again Mark Twain. What is the secret of his immortality? Mark Twain couldn't answer. He didn't believe in the true God and things of that nature. But the answer for Mark Twain's question, what is the secret of his immortality? Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, the Abrahamic covenant. Jeremiah 30, verse 11. Jeremiah 30, verse 11 spells out the principles why the Jews will always survive. Isaiah chapter 54, verse 17, Isaiah 54, 17, no weapon raised against the Jews will prosper. It'll kill some Jews, But the goal was to kill all the Jews, and they'll always fail. Also, you have Malachi chapter 3, verse 6. Malachi 3, verse 6, spelling out the nature of God. And no weapon formed against the Jewish people will prosper. As you move into the New Testament, you can see the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant, first of all, on the local church basis. You can see the principle in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Romans 1:16. The principle is, I will bless them that bless you, but I will curse them that curse you. And the principle, Romans 1:16, in the first two chapters appears 3 times, to the Jew first. To the Jew first. The Jew first. In the book of Acts, in 10 different passages, actually 12 different passages, if you see, when the gospel goes out, it always goes out to the Jew first. That is the target. So the Bible spells out 3 specific blessings for the Jewish people that will in turn receive blessings themselves. First of all, praying for the Jewish population. This is Psalm 122, verse 6. Psalm 122, verse 6. Presenting the gospel in the book of Romans is to go to the Jew first, spelled out 3 times in the first 2 chapters of Romans. The gospel is to go out to the Jew first. Thirdly, in the support of different ministries, the giving should begin with the outworking of giving first to Jewish missions and then secondly to other kinds of missions as well. And these are the kinds of blessings that the different churches, you have churches that are anti-Semitic, you have churches which are anti-Israel, they don't receive these kind of blessings. But churches who always speak on behalf of the Jews, reach out to the Jewish people and so on, and not failing to get the gospel out to the Jews, they're receiving the blessings of the gospel of that day. I brought some with me. Our summer program will begin at the very end of August, Acts 29. I have this brochure that will deal with the summer program. So if you want to come in and enjoy, it's only about an hour and a half drive from here. And you can spend 1 week or you can spend all 12 and a half weeks. I would encourage you to attend. And I have extra copies of this. You can see me in my pew there, and I'll be able to pass those out to you. I'm done.